Sean Diddy Combs was once known for throwing extravagant and even wild parties, with attendees being some of the most famous people in Tinseltown. Now those once famous parties are considered infamous. But Combs' fall from grace happened nearly a year prior to his arrest, when his former girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, filed a jaw-dropping lawsuit accusing him of forcing her to participate in drug-fueled orgies known as freak-offs, as well as being mentally and physically abusive towards her throughout their decade-long relationship. Of course, we know that lawsuit was filed and settled within 24 hours. However, those two words, freak-offs, have seemingly become synonymous with Combs. But is it possible that he didn't learn this on his own, instead possibly getting the idea from another family member, like his own mom? Yeah, as disturbing and gross as it sounds, one of Diddy's friends says Janice Combs often threw wild parties of her own when the producer was younger. Hip-hop producer Tim Dog Patterson, a childhood friend of Diddy, made the shocking claim in the latest Peacock documentary, Diddy, The Making of a Bad Boy. He said, "I've always been asked the question why. I don't know the answer to why, but I truly believe it goes back to childhood." Well, the 55-year-old appeared to not have the most idyllic white picket fence childhood. He grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, after his mom moved their family there after his father, Melvin Combs, was murdered in '72. Melvin was known to run around with drug kingpins such as Nicky Barnes and Frank Lucas. And according to Patterson, while Diddy played Little League, made the football team, and ironically was an altar boy, he was still bullied as a kid. Patterson claims that there was always things going on at Diddy's home, like Janice throwing wild parties. He said a younger Diddy was exposed to a lot, like all types of alcohol, reefer smoke, drug addicts were around, he was around pimps and pushers. Patterson says that was just who was in our house. People that attended the parties were from Harlem, from the streets. It wouldn't be a thing to mistakenly walk into one of the bedrooms and you got a couple in there butt naked. Sound familiar? Well, Patterson added, that's what we were privy to. This is what we were fed. Was it desensitizing us? I'm sure it was. Were we aware of it? No, that was just Saturday night. Well, it seems like Diddy, Janice's alleged parties were also the secret talk of the town. DJ Easy Lee Davis, who also grew up with Diddy, said he never attended Janice's alleged wild parties, but he heard rumors about what happened there. Diddy himself has previously been vocal about his early introduction to sex. He told Vibe magazine in '99 he lost his virginity at just 12 years old and frequently watched porn, trying to replicate the moves he saw. At this time, neither Janice nor Sean Combs have publicly responded to these claims, but the matriarch has seemingly been supporting her son through his federal sex trafficking trial, even offering up her own home to try to help secure bail for her son, which we know was denied multiple times. As for the disgraced mogul, he remains in federal detention until his upcoming high-profile trial that's slated to begin in May. However, despite a federal trial still looming over his head, he still faces almost 40 civil lawsuits from women and men who accuse him of sexual misconduct. His reps have denied any and all the allegations made against him in the various lawsuits, saying Mr. Combs has never sexually assaulted or sex trafficked anyone, man or woman, adult or minor. So much to unpack with this latest claim, so let's bring on now forensic and clinical psychologist Dr. Joni Johnston. Joni, always great to see you. First I have to get your reaction to this claim against Sean Diddy Combs or against Sean Diddy Combs' mother, I should say, that she allegedly threw her own wild sex parties when Diddy was younger. What do you make of all of this?
Well, certainly there's a lot of information that needs to be substantiated, investigated, and those kinds of things. But when we look at people who become sexual offenders, we oftentimes see early exposure to sexuality, whether that's pornography or actual sexual behavior. And we oftentimes see that within the family. And so, that kind of environment growing up in is going to have an impact on a child growing up. Now, it doesn't make excuses for what people do in adulthood. And the form that can take really depends on a lot of different things, including things such as what are the family values? Are the family values about, being open and honest about things? Or if there's trauma in a family, do families deal with it? Or how is that child raised? Is this child raised as somebody to be tough, to be more of aggressive, or is this child taught to be something different? So it's complicated in terms of how people turn out the way that they are. But it doesn't surprise me if the allegations against him are true that he was exposed to sexuality at an early and inappropriate age.
I want to give a huge thanks to you, our viewers, and our amazing sponsors like Upside. Upside is a super cool and free app that gets you cash back on daily essentials like gas, groceries, and restaurants. Whether it's a nice restaurant or a quick grab and go meal, I can use Upside for both. And guess what? I can use Upside to get cash back when I do. It's really so easy and simple to use and completely free, so why not try it? This is actual real cash back too. It's money that appears in your Upside app that you can transfer straight into your bank account. So here's what you do. You download the Upside app, claim an offer for whatever you're buying on Upside, you pay as usual using a debit or a credit card, and follow the steps on the app and get paid. You can use Upside at places like Dunkin' Donuts, Cinnabon, Pinkberry, Chipotle, 7-Eleven, Taco Bell, and so many other places. So why not check it out and see if your favorite spot is on the app? To find out how much you could earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on your screen, use our promo code LC News, and get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Again, that's promo code LC News for an extra 25 cents back on your first gallon of gas. Yeah, and kind of going back to just some of the articles that he had given or some of the interviews he had given back in the 90s, he had been very vocal about how he had lost his virginity at the age of 12 years old. In your opinion, do you think that this was just a sign of the times? It's the 70s, people are very kind of more lax and kind of those kind of virtues, I should say, in a way. But do you think that any of this was just a sign of the times?
I think that our sensitivity around sexuality and the impact it can have, if it's, if it happens prematurely, the impact of sexual trauma or sexual abuse, we've become much more sensitive, fortunately, and much more aware of those kinds of things. I don't, though, think that, engaging, for example, in sexual intercourse at age 12 was ever a norm. We look historically at the average age of sex. I mean, it's been between like 15 and 17, certainly for quite a while now. So, having sex at 12 is very, very young. And so, where there might have been a lack of sensitivity to the potential impact of exposing children to maybe adults having sex and those kinds of things, I don't think that we can justify or say that it was just because of the times.
And what do you make of Diddy's childhood friend saying that it was desensitizing and just a regular Saturday night over there?
Well, I think that that's, any of us who have children, and I have four myself, I mean, we know that children grow up in an environment and it's normal to them. So I have certainly interviewed people who've had incredible trauma in their family or incredible abuse, bizarre things that were going on. And yet, from that child's perspective, it was normal. I mean, I can remember one interview that I had with somebody and I was asking him about physical abuse. And he's like, no, I didn't have any in my family. And then I realized early on that I was going to have to change that question for people and ask about specific behaviors because oftentimes there was this lack of recognition that this was abuse. This was normal to them. And so, unless I ask about specific behaviors, I might not get the answer that I thought I was getting, or I was misinterpreting that. And so, children do think of things as normal in their family. And so, other adults who are not involved in that situation might look at it and go, "This is abusive. This is exploitative of children to have for them to be exposed to that." But for that child, this is normal. This is a normal Saturday night. This is what I grew up seeing and being exposed to.
And I know when like the lawsuits had first started coming out against Sean Diddy Combs, a lot of people were kind of wondering how did Diddy become this way or get this way? Obviously there's also, that power dynamic that we could also kind of attribute to the allegations that have been made against him as well too. But do you also think that being exposed to sex and this at this very young age during a very developmental time in his life, do you think this may have attributed to kind of his thoughts and thinking about sex in terms of, maybe in his mind, maybe he thinks that women or men are just objects and that, sex is just possibly transactional, that type of thing. But what do you think this exposure kind of did to him? Do you think that kind of attributed to him becoming the way he did?
I think there are two really interesting parts of that. One is our early exposure to sex, both in terms of what we're taught as well as what we experience, certainly shapes our understanding of sex, our understanding of the context of how sex is supposed to be, what kind of relationship it's likely to involve, and those kinds of things. If we witness a parent having sex casually, then we start thinking this is how you have sex. But I think another question that we just can't ignore is is the fact is a role of power. Because one question is, how does somebody become the way they are? And then another question is, how are they allowed to stay the way that they are? And I think that also speaks to this kind of, lack of accountability or lack of consequences for individuals who begin to abuse power and begin to abuse people. And I think that in many respects is as big of an issue here as anything.
Now, let's just say these allegations or these claims are true about Diddy's mom, for instance. What do you think as far as kind of translating, or not translating, that's probably the wrong word, but kind of seeing that pattern repeat itself when it comes to Diddy's own children? I'm specifically talking about his sons here, where, they have faced their own kind of legal issues as well to Diddy's sons. But do you think it's a far stretch to think that Diddy also exposed his own sons to this at a young age?
There is so much literature and research that talks about this kind of multi-generational passing of not just trauma, but just ideas of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what is acceptable behavior within this family, what is not acceptable behavior. Again, for one family, you take responsibility for your behavior. For another person, for another family, it's don't get caught. So I think when we look at families, it's there's a reason why we see oftentimes things passed down from generation to generation, because it often takes a conscious effort to not do the same things that we saw our parents do and our parents saw our grandparents do. The things that are automatic are things that we were exposed to, that we learned, the values that we grew up with.
And in your opinion, does how does this all kind of play into this kind of narrative that it seemed like Diddy was also trying to kind of portray for himself? This all around family man who loved his sons, loved his daughters. And, while that might still be true, he still allegedly engaged in this type of behavior where the women and the men say that he was very abusive sexually towards them. But these alleged victims in these cases and these accusers are also someone else's child, and so what do you make of just kind of that facade that it seems that he was kind of portraying in a way of this all-American family man who, came up from the bottom to where he is now, but then still like kind of engaged in this Jekyll and Hyde kind of behavior behind the scenes?
Well, I can't obviously speak for, Sean Combs himself in terms of his behavior, but I can tell you that it is, people are complicated. And it's not uncommon for me to see individuals who genuinely love their children, even love their spouse, and yet have horrific behaviors with other people. And it's almost like in their minds, they have this in group versus out group. And so the people that are in their in group, whether it's their children, whether it's their best friends, whether it's their family of origin or whatever, they treat them very differently. They expose them differently. They send them different messages. They protect them. They care about them. And yet other people that they don't have that aren't part of that in group, they're seen as objects, disposable, playthings. And so it's not so simple that, it's always like this person treats everybody the same. We've seen serial killers, for example, who are married, and the spouse said, I had no idea he treated me like a princess, or the daughter said, oh, he loved me so much, this can't be, I can't believe my dad would do this. And yet the victims described somebody who is a monster, and it's the same person.
I also kind of want to ask you this. Diddy's defense attorney kind of made an interesting argument at one of his hearings, over, or excuse me, last year, I should say, where he kind of made this argument that he feels that sex is kind of on trial for his federal sex trafficking trial, racketeering, conspiracy, transportation to engage in prostitution. Where do you think kind of that line is between engaging in, you know, orgies and this type of sex versus what these allegations are kind of stemming from: drugging, raping, forcing women and men to engage with, commercial sex workers, that type of thing. Where do you think that line kind of is between possibly normal sexual behaviors versus criminal ones?
I think in many respects it's pretty clear. It's about consent. We're talking about consensual sex versus unconsensual sex. And I, for one, will never have a problem with unconsensual sex or rape or sexual assault being on trial. It should be on trial.
And, just kind of as far as where Diddy stands right now, in your opinion, and I know we're, kind of veering off of what the claims are against his mother, but in your opinion, how do you think he's handling, in a way, just everything kind of crashing down on himself by all accounts by his own alleged behavior. But, being in jail for months now, about to face trial for sex trafficking charges, could possibly face that, more than decade long prison sentence. But in your mind, how do you go from like, or in your opinion, excuse me, how do you go from like this once enamored figure who hosted the parties that everyone wanted a ticket to now being behind bars, after it seems like all these behaviors and alleged crimes have caught up to him?
Most of the high profile offenders I've evaluated tended to really kind of were almost in denial for a significant number of months. There was this belief, I'm going to get out of prison, oftentimes because they had not been held accountable for so long, for so many horrific things. And this kind of denial has tended to set in. And then when they were convicted, if they were convicted, there's a kind of a saying in prison that the first year is the hardest, that you do 10 years in that first year. And so I think that, if these charges are true, if he is convicted, it wouldn't surprise me that there would be this huge crash during that first year when reality does set in. Of course, there's always the hope for appeals and those kinds of things. But I wouldn't be surprised if right now he's still holding on to this idea and he hasn't been convicted of anything, that he's going to walk out of there, without any convictions.
And kind of going back to the claims against Diddy's mother, Janice Combs, do you think, again, if these claims are true, obviously we don't know that at this point, they haven't responded to these allegations. But if these claims are true, do you think in her mind, she may be like, what did I kind of do when he was younger? How did I kind of expose him to this? Do you think that there's any type of regret or remorse or even just kind of a think back to being like, oh, wow, maybe this was something I shouldn't have done when he was younger. I shouldn't have exposed him to this type of behaviors.
That's a really tough question, I think, to answer. I mean, not having talked to her, not knowing her family background, not knowing her family legacy and those kinds of things. I think she was obviously much younger than she is now. We don't know what her thinking was at that time. She sounded like somebody who was very ambitious for her children. In many respects, she worked, from what we know, 3 jobs to put her kids through private school, and there's been some allegations that one of those jobs was as an escort worker, and her son might have been exposed to that. So, how is she is looking back? Does she think, well, I did it all for my children so they could survive, and this was part of it? Does she look back now and think, I'm this age now, and looking back, I mean, I can't imagine any parent who doesn't have regrets about some things. But I think it's a really difficult question to answer, because I know she was in a position at that time where she was trying very hard to support her family, and part of that certainly seemed to involve a lot of playtime as well. So it's hard to answer that question.
In terms of exposure, is there any type of difference between young male children being exposed to, alleged wild sex parties, that type of thing, versus young women or young girls being exposed to it, possibly at the same age? Because from what we understand right now, Diddy's sister kind of has she hasn't been accused of any type of like these types of behaviors or anything like that. But do you think there's any type of difference in little girls being exposed to this type of thing versus little boys?
I think there is some difference when we look at early exposure to inappropriate sex and those kinds of things within a family between boys and girls as a group. Obviously, every person is an individual, and I think one of the differences that we often see is that girls are more likely to be victimized later on, and boys are more likely to become perpetrators. And I think the reason for that is because of the sex roles that are often assigned to men and women. I think boys are, more likely encouraged to be the aggressor still, and girls are not as much, and so they're more likely to be victimized. And it's interesting. I was reading a study recently that was looking at children who had sex at a very early age, under the age of 14, which is kind of out of the norm. So between 3 and 8% of boys have had sex before the age of 14. So it's definitely in the minority. And what's interesting is in this study, they found that only about half the boys said they really wanted to have sex at that age. They felt this peer pressure to engage in this activity. And so I think that does speak to these different gender roles, in terms of, I'm supposed to want this, I'm supposed to be the aggressor, and those kinds of things. And I think that experience in combination with other things, I really want to underline that, because we know that most people who are exposed to inappropriate sexual activity who are sexually abused do not become perpetrators, male or female. So it's that experience in combination with other things that tends to lead to somebody becoming a predator later on.
And of course, with Diddy's trial coming up in May, I'm sure we'll learn a lot more as this case continues to develop, it seems. Dr. Joni Johnson, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Before we sign you off, though, is there anything else about these allegations that you would like to add?
I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens in the future. I'm very happy that, I mean, I guess one thing I would just like to say is that, nobody should be a victim and nobody should get away with victimizing other people for years and years. And again, that's whether it's Sean Combs or whether it's somebody else. And so I'm hoping that one thing that comes out of this trial, if in fact these allegations are true, is that people will have more courage to speak up in the future.
All right. Again, Dr. Joni Johnson, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
Sean Combs, aka Diddy, has pleaded not guilty to charges of sex trafficking, racketeering, conspiracy, and transportation to engage in prostitution. His next court hearing is slated for February, and his trial is expected to begin on May 5th. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Elizabeth Millner.